shared with you the quip, and there is some truth to this, that the collapse of communism took 10 years in Poland, 10 months in Hungary, 10 days in Czechoslovakia, and 10 hours in Romania. Of course, this is a simplification, but particularly for the exam, it's a good way to think about things when you're trying to think about the chronology of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War. Revolution turned out to be contagious, and countries and people sort of were emboldened by changes in other areas. To recap briefly, in January 1989, solidarity was legalized in Poland. By April 1990, the communist government, gave up the monopoly of power. Poland was fully independent by 1990 under the first president, Lech Walesa. Hungary, in the summer of 1989, opened its borders. We saw this border to Austria. We saw this in the reference, in the film last night, for those of you who were at the film forum. There was the note that there were East German apartments left open in Berlin because people had gone on vacation to Hungary, not anticipating the fall of the Berlin Wall, then escaped to the west through Hungary. Of course, we had Gorbachev's announcement that the Soviet Union would not interfere. In Germany, the Berlin Wall fell on November 9th. And then in Czechoslovakia, there was the Velvet Revolution of December 1989. By 1990, the Soviet Union itself allowed other political parties. The Baltics declared independence. In 1991, there was an attempted coup. And then the republics of Central Asia, Ukraine, left the Soviet Union. By the end of that year, the Soviet Union was declared officially dissolved. The other important point to remember, particularly for the exam, is that the impetus of change, where change came from the populations and key individuals within the Eastern Bloc countries. Now, communist regimes also fell in Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, and these were the three of the Eastern European states that didn't have significant reform movements. I'm going to talk about Romania very briefly because the fall of communism in Romania was not bloodless. Of course, Romania had a very corrupt leader, Nicolae Ceausescu, and he claimed that reform would come to Romania, quote, when pears grow on poplar trees. However, emboldened by events in Eastern Europe, in December 1989, there were demonstrations throughout all of Romania. Ceausescu called for a massive demonstration of support in order to counter these other demonstrations. He sort of orchestrated what was supposed to be a demonstration of support for his regime in Bucharest. But this soon turned against him, so he ordered troops to fire on the population, on the crowds. Most refused. Now, the secret police, who were, understandably, loath, did fire, and tanks crushed protesters. So there was some reminiscence of Tiananmen Square in this event. Ceausescu and his wife later tried to escape Romania, but they were caught and charged with embezzlement of government funds and murder. Now, it was an illegal tribunal, but they were condemned to death and they were shot. So this all happened very, very rapidly. Today, we're going to move on to the breakup of Yugoslavia, extreme violence that took place in the Balkans, because after the collapse of communism in East Central Europe, the most unstable spot was Yugoslavia. So we're going to start right away with a film clip. This is a Croatian film from 2003. It's called Witnesses, and it was the winner of the Berlin Film Festival. Has anyone here seen it before? No. Okay, all right. Basically, it's based on real-life war crimes that took place during the Serbo-Croatian War. The director is Vinko Rezin, Now, some thought that his depiction was too unheroic, the way he depicted Croatian soldiers. And he also chose a very well-known Serbian actress to play the main character so that it could be sort of a joint effort or joint production. Now, the film sort of depicts neighbor against neighbor in this small village. So it's about all of these kind of ethnic tensions that arise because of the violence that's happening. They don't cause the violence, but they arise because of it. So there's two brothers, and basically the story is that the younger brother, Croatian soldier, he tries to intimidate the strong-arm, one of his Serb neighbors, so he burns his house down, kills him, and kidnaps the daughter. The other brother, the older brother, tries to sort of tries to save the girl, to repair the situation, which means his brother will be then accused and tried for war crimes. So in this, we see in the relationship between the two brothers the sort of corrosive effect of violence. This is embodied by the younger brother, by his actions. But we also see the resilience of people trying to build a better society. And this is embodied by the older brother. So the film itself goes back and forth between the crime, between the war scenes, and between discussions about how to deal with the younger brother's crime. So what you're going to also see today, it's about a 6-minute clip, you'll also see some of the tactics of humiliation that soldiers used against perceived enemies, and you'll see the random violence of the war.
Koji ti kurac?
Opet radiš u stari?
Koji u školu?
Kad ste vi u školu? Ja škola više nije škola. Ti ukradaš dnevnik, ja ga zapalim da ne uhvati, pa uhvati mene. I kako ćeš sad kupom stiskati?
A ne stvarno kako ćeš stiskati kupom.
Šta ima, uopće nije problem to. Uzmeš kočicu od bicikla, montiraš na mijenjač, spojiš sajam sa kuplom i pritisneš mijenjač, pa ti to. Nije to neka velika mehanika, ja to za 2 popodne vidiš.
No najbolje ti uzeti automatika kao ja imam. Nema kuplom.
Daj ključ od auta. Kad mama zaspi, ja ću doći pomalo. Više nećeš vidjeti. Rasti kući.
Nemoj, to smo minirali! Miješao si krešu.
Bara, ajde 100 maraka da ću pogoditi onu ovcu tamo. Ja pogodio.
Ti ćeš sve srediti? Da. Rekao si da mama više neću vidjeti. Nećeš. Lažeš. Prevest ću preko granice, onda ću ju pustiti samo ide na drugu stranu. Tamo će neko spriviti. Lažeš, hoćeš mi zajebati? Što bi ti rađe ubio? Da ja završim u zatvoru. Hoću. Ja ću te prijaviti.
Nećeš.
Hoću.
Nećeš zbog mame.
Hoću još.
Nećeš!
Moraš prvo ubiti mene. Neću šutiti još. Šta zbog nje radiš? Idiot, huh?
Okay. I will let you watch the film at your leisure to find out what happens.
What's it called?
Witnesses. Yeah, and I'll put it, when everything gets posted on Blackboard, you'll have the details, the director, the year, and everything. And actually, Kelly Library has it here at Robarts. I think they have a few copies of it. Okay, so the breakup of Yugoslavia and the ensuing violence really tragically illustrates the complexity of national identity, the impact of ethnic politics, and by this, I don't mean ancient ethnic hatreds, but rather politicians using sort of the idea of ethnicity or the ethnic or nationalist card to gain power. So this sort of, Yugoslavia is the most tragic example of this in the post-communist era. Tito, identified as Croat, but he held strongly to the idea that communism was a way to end any ethnic rivalries that might have existed. And after World War II, despite some of the sort of divisions that occurred, and we'll talk about the legacies of World War II, Yugoslavs did live in relative harmony during and after Tito's reign. After Tito's death in 1980, there was a collective presidency that rotated every year among the republics. This system functioned. Now, there were some ethnic tensions that existed, particularly between the two largest ethnic groups, Croats and Serbians. But generally, the system was functioning and it was relatively harmonious. So the dissolution of Yugoslavia happened relatively quickly. The movement for political reform began in January 1990 in Slovenia. Then new parties formed in each of the 6 republics, including Serbia. Now in Serbia, communist leaders still opposed reform. So the Communist Party changed its name to the Socialist Party, and they won a majority in Serbia and also in Montenegro. In Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia, and Macedonia, non-communists won the majority. In Croatia, the nationalist Franjo Tuđman won the election, which led to increased tensions between Croatia and the Yugoslav state. So you have this rhetoric of nationalism coming out quite early on. Milosevic, the leader of the Serb Communist or Socialist Party, then espoused the creation of a greater Serbia that would include all territories populated by Serbs. So there was nationalist rhetoric on all sides. In December 1990, Slovenia voted for independence. In June of 1991, it declared its independence. Now, after a 10-day war, Serbian President Milosevic withdrew and allowed Slovenian independence. So there was certainly violence, but it wasn't extended. It was fairly brief. However, at the same time, Croatians also declared their independence. And this resulted in violent conflicts between Croats and Serbs. The Yugoslavian People Army supported the People's Army in Croatia, who fought against secession from the state. So, from the fall of 1991, there was very, very bitter violence. The walled city of Dubrovnik in Croatia on the Adriatic coast, beautiful city, was severely damaged through shelling and mortars. And it had been one of the most beautiful and historic cities in Europe. Now the violence finished in January 1992 with the independence of Croatia. However, parts remained under Serb control. Having said this, there was still sporadic violence until 1995. Now, even the news presentations at the time, Western news, international news, the discussions always talked about people as if they were already neatly divided. And this wasn't the case. Yugoslavia was a very mixed country. Populations themselves had intermarried for generations. Under Tito, there had been sort of concerted attempts to mix up the populations. And World War II itself had contributed to any breakdown that had existed before of sort of neat enclaves based on ethnicity. Actually, even Tito himself had one parent who was Croatian and one who was Slovenian. However, once the war began in Croatian territories, from both sides, there were efforts to sort of, quote, clean territories by removing populations deemed unwanted, unsuitable, and bringing in those considered proper. And this was based on ethnicity. The idea of ethnic cleansing actually was invented or developed during the Balkan Wars, or at least the terminology was. So ethnic violence was a part of the war, but it wasn't necessarily the cause of the war. We'll talk more about that towards the end of the lecture. Now, local Serb militias within Croatia, supported and armed by Yugoslav army units, tried to purge territories as they took control. Croats did the same. So this procedure, this ethnic cleansing, created a kind of homogenization in regions that where it had not previously existed. This process involved a combination of killing, expulsion, destruction of property, and the use of extreme violence and terror to try to make people who weren't killed, who didn't die, to try to make them at least afraid of returning home, of trying to regain their homes or their property. And this is why rape was such an important part of the arsenal, because it meant that people would not return home. The fear of shame of returning home was too much. And dismemberment was actually also a crucial tool. Now, these methods, described as if they expressed intense hatred, were terribly typical of efforts to redraw ethnographic maps. Although the war involved high rates of killing, there was a much higher rate of displacement. There were literally millions of refugees who tried to find any place of safety. And this, in and of itself, exacerbated the cycles of violence, because people were on the move. And what it meant was that even for people who might have been quite indifferent about any sort of ethnic or even religious identity, they didn't really have the luxury of remaining indifferent, because they were being pulled into this conflict, whether violence was perpetrated against them or if they were forcibly expelled. So violence hardened whatever pre-existing lines of ethnicity there were. Now, the breakup was uneven. For instance, in September 1991, Macedonia declared independence, but it wasn't a site of violence. In Bosnia, Herzegovina, a very ethnically diverse republic, in March 1992, a majority of Bosnian Muslims and Croats voted for the independence of their republic. However, Bosnian Serbs refused to recognize the legality of the plebiscite, and instead, backed by Milosevic, who was the leader of Serbia, the remaining Slav state, they set up their own breakaway Serb republic. This was led by Radovan Karadzic, and it tried to resist independence for that region. And a bitter civil war broke out. I'm not going to refer to the pictures that I show, but I'm just going to include them for you. Now, in this case, in the case of Bosnia, two former enemies, Milosevic, leader of Serbia, and Tudjman, the leader of Croatia, president of Croatia, they actually cooperated in order to divide Bosnia-Herzegovina between them. This is an important fact because in this, you see how this isn't about ancient hatreds. It's about nationality, the gain of economics, and power. Now, the war that began in 1992 in Bosnia-Herzegovina far surpassed the earlier stage in the war in Croatia in terms of violence. For the next 2.5 years, until 1995, when hostilities ended, Bosnia-Herzegovina became the site of the worst massacres in Europe since World War II. Bosnian Serbs carried out this ethnic cleansing, again, mass executions and rapes. In 1995, 8,000 men and boys were massacred in fields outside the town in the safe area of Srebrenica. And I'm going to read you the testimony of a perpetrator who was involved in this massacre. His name is Dragan Obrenovic. Now, he was the chief of staff and deputy commander of an infantry brigade of the Bosnian Serb army. After Srebrenica fell to Bosnian Serb forces in July 1995, he had helped to implement the plan to kill Bosnian civilians and also prisoners of war. Now, he's indicted for this, for his role in the massacres, And in 2003, he pleaded guilty to crimes against humanity before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or the ICTY. And he's actually serving a 17-year sentence right now in a Norwegian prison. So I'm going to read you part of his testimony. At the beginning of the war, it seemed as if the war and all it brought with us was impossible, that this wasn't really happening to us, and that everything would be resolved within a few days. We didn't even notice how we were drawn into the vortex of inter-ethnic hatred and how neighbors were no longer able to live beside each other. How death moved into the vicinity, and we didn't even notice that we had gotten used to death. In Bosnia, a neighbor means even more than a relative. In Bosnia, having coffee with your neighbor is a ritual, and this is what we trampled on, and this is what we forgot. And in this vortex of terrible misfortune and horror, the horror of Srebrenica happened. I am here before your honors because I wish to express my remorse. I have thought for a long time, and I'm always followed by the same thought: guilt. I find it very hard to say, but this is true. I am to blame for everything I did at that time. I am trying to erase all of this and to be what I was not. I am also to blame for what I did not do, for not trying to protect those prisoners. Regardless of the temporary nature of my then post, I ask myself again and again, what could I have done that I didn't do? Thousands of innocent victims perish, graves remain behind, refugees, general destruction, misfortune, and misery. I bear responsibility for this. Now I'm also going to read you the testimony of a victim. In 1992, Hasan Nujanovic and his family fled the violence in their part of Bosnia, in their hometown, but they only got so far as Srebrenica. Now the United Nations peacekeepers had arrived in this area in 1993, and Nujanovic found a job with them as a translator. When the Bosnian Serb army attacked Srebrenica in 1995, Nujanovic and his family sought shelter at the UN compound, the UN base, along with about 30,000 other civilians. Now the Dutch peacekeepers, a very famous case, handed the civilians over to the Bosnian Serbs, who separated men, women, and children. And Nujanovic was allowed to stay on the base because of his job as a translator. But he desperately sought permission for his family to remain with him on the base. His parents and brothers, however, were forced off of the United Nations base. And all three were actually among the 8,000 Bosnian Serbs that were killed. Now, Nujanovic has since learned some more of the details about where and how his family was killed, but to date their remains have not been found. So this is his testimony. So the crowd of 30,000 people came down to where the Dutch base was located from Srebrenica on the 11th of July in the afternoon. People came down because they thought that the Serbs were coming to kill them. I realized that the only way to survive was to remain on the compound for as long as possible with the Dutch. I was there with my family in the room when 3 Dutch soldiers came, looked at my family and at me, and told me, "Hasan, tell your family that they have to leave the compound." Now I knew that I could stay because I had the contract with the United Nations, so the Dutch could not throw me out of the base. I was trying to convince the UN, the Dutch, to allow my brother to stay at least. But my brother said to me, "Stop begging for me. I don't want you to beg them for me. I will go out and I will do as all of the other people did." At this point, I realized that Franken was going to allow my father to remain on the base. Franken was the Dutch soldier. And Franken said that's because he was one of the 3 representatives of the refugees. And then I translated these words to my father. My father asked Franken like this. He pointed at my brother and he said, "Okay, but what about my other son?" And Franken said, "Well, tell your father if he doesn't want to stay